and welcome. I'm very excited today. We have Vivian Kline with us, and she's going to talk a bit about her life. At this moment, if you would please go ahead and mute yourself while I spotlight Vivian.
We should turn.
That didn't work. Let me try again. Okay, it keeps changing for me, guys. I'm sorry. Give me one moment.
There I am, sharing.
There you are. And so is Debbie, and I'm not sure how to take Debbie off of the spotlight.
Well,
give me a moment. Sorry,
take a nap, Debbie.
Okay. Did we do it this time? I think we did it.
I think so. Very good.
Okay. Take it away,
Hello.
Vivian.
I am Vivian Kline. I am 98 years old, and I don't know whether I'm giving this speech because I'm 98 years old. I knew that somebody had been 100 and given a speech, and I thought maybe once you get very old, you get to give a talk, or maybe there's another reason. At any rate, I am game to tell you about my long life. I started back in ancestors who came from Germany. I had a wealthy widow who came from Germany and bought a brownstone house at 57 West 91st Street in Manhattan on the Upper West Side. And my father grew up there, and he would take the trolley up to Columbia and became a doctor after going to first 4-year school and then medical school. And in those days, if you had enough money, the thing to do was to go for a year of training in Germany. And somehow they had enough money to do that. And he became a general practitioner. There were no such things as specialties. And he claimed, and my children's eyes were big as saucers when I told the story, he said he would not marry until he had enough money to support his parents. So he was fairly old when he married, old in comparison to today's ages. And he married my mother, who had been a shy, studious girl with 4 outdoorsy brothers. And she had a teacher in a public school in New York State who had gone to Vassar College. And she advised my mother to go to Vassar. Vassar cost 400 hard dollars, but $400 a year. And Vassar meant a huge amount to her. And she had 2 best friends who, like many other educated women in those days, never married. Men were afraid of educated women. Maybe they still are, I don't know. At any rate, she knew my father for 6 years, was never allowed to be alone with him. They went to concerts and there was a chaperone and so forth. They went to dinner parties. And after 6 years, he asked her to marry, and she said yes. And he planted his first kiss. I can still picture my teenage daughter's eyes as big as saucers when I told them this story. So he brought his bride to the brownstone house, and he had enough money to have his parents move to an apartment nearby. And my mother, how to describe my mother? She almost always had a novel in progress. She did a lot of reading. She did a little outside work. She uh, led a book of great books group in Mount Sinai Hospital. And she was mostly at home and mostly a very good daughter to her aged parents. And she had breakfast in bed, and the phone would ring, and it would be, "Good morning, the butcher." And she would give an order, and then it would be, "Good morning, the grocer." She would give an order. And she uh, led what today would be a very leisurely life. And she lived to be 94, so it seemed to agree with her. And I was the youngest of three. My sister was first and was very bright, and they skipped her in school. In those days, they did that. And so she graduated fairly young and went to Vassar and did very well there. And my brother came next, and he was musical, and he had something called left eye dominant and right hand dominant, which was something new. And one of the doctors my father knew had written a book about that. It made reading difficult, and he was musical when he played the cello. My father played the violin, and my mother and my sister played the piano, and I was not as musical. At any rate, that was the story. When my sister went to Vassar and went on to get working on a PhD at Columbia, we had a summer house, which was 2 long hours on the Boston Post Road with many red lights. And it took so long that we broke up the trip for lunch at the Rippewam Grill. When the highways came in, the trip turned out to be an hour instead of 2 hours. And the little town that my parents had bought a house in had no grocery store. It had a liquor store and a car store. And we had to go to the next town to get groceries. And it was a farmer's town. And the house was built in 1803 and on a dirt road. And when the highways developed, and it only took an hour to get to New York, business people bought the town, summer places in the town, or maybe even full year round places. And it is now the wealthiest town in America. It's Westport, Connecticut. But we had wonderful summers in Westport. And this was an old farmhouse. And my parents had friends who bought the barn, which was nearby, and converted it into a modern building for their use. And they had 2 children. And there was a big front lawn, and we played baseball. And I was the youngest, and the other couple had a athletic boy. And occasionally when we played football, he would pass the football to me and I would run like crazy. But they also built a tennis court, and I learned to play tennis. First, I watched for hours, or so it seemed to me, when everybody would play, and then they would play with me for a few minutes. And the next thing I knew, I was good enough to be playing with others. And this crazy thing is, when I think back on it, we always wore white shorts and white tops. And of course, my name was the same as my brother's, and he played. And we played at one time with guests of the other couple. And we were introduced as Vivian Bass and Walter Bass. And they thought we were married. And we thought that was so funny. I don't remember whether we beat them or not, but they say now, maybe because I've played tennis from age 6 to age 92, that may be why I am probably the healthiest person where I live now at age 98. At any rate, my schooling consisted of my mother having found a private school within walking distance on West 91st Street. It was on 93rd Street. It was two brownstones on 93rd Street and two brownstone houses on 94th Street with the yards in between. And the name was Birch Wathen because it was run by Miss Birch and Mrs. Wathen. Mrs. Wathen had the first grades up till 8th grade, and Miss Birch took over for the high school. They were two very different people. Mrs. Wathen was English and had studied with his name escapes me at the moment, but had studied educational theory, and it was a progressive education made fun of in one of the novels. We did indeed dance with colored scarves and dance barefoot on the floors in the music room. And we had a subject matter for each grade. And all of us loved 4th grade and Egypt. And we made scarabs, and we made, when it was younger age, we made a house, and I was a Dutch housewife, and we put a blue pillow on the door because I had a boy. But 4th grade Egypt was memorable for all of us. And when I went to Egypt many years later and saw the tombs that we had studied, it was a very emotional experience, something that probably religious people would feel if they went to Jerusalem. Trying to think what I wanted to tell you next.
Going to college?
Well, college was something else again. I was good in art. We had Japanese brushes and water-based paints. And if your work was considered good, it was tucked on the wall with Scotch tape. And when my children went to public school, and I saw these very professional glass cases where things were hung, I realized it was a very different aesthetic. I had a friend who was interested in art, and she went all through Birch Wathen, and we went back to visit the art teacher when we were adults, and we described the fact that we each made a ship in 4th grade, I think, and we worked all year on our ship, and at the end of the year we gave a talk about our ship. And I still remember to this day various people's ships. And I made the Spanish Armada, and we painted the sails, and we made the little rigging on the edge, and we sanded the base. And when we told this teacher, as adults going back to school, the teacher said, "I can't give a project that lasts longer than 2 weeks." And we had this project for months, just a different sense of time. Well, when it came to college, I had been good in art, as they used to say. So somebody said I should go to art school. Well, I'd never visited an art school, and nobody took me to one. And everybody else in my class was going to college. So I decided to go to Pembroke because it had an art school right down the street that you could take classes and get credit for. And I thought that was sort of hedging my bets. But in those days, you only applied to one college because everybody just got in. There wasn't this business of applying to many. And I didn't get in. The person in my class was not as able as I, but she had two very bright sisters who went to that school, and they took her. And by then it was too late to apply anywhere else. And so I went where my mother and sister had gone. And it was not the right place for me, but they took me because that's who I was. And I went to religion classes with my roommate, and there I learned about religion because in my background, religion was not mentioned. And I knew that my grandfather had come as a boy of 14, leaving Judaism and the threat of going into the army behind, and he came to his uncle's business in New York. And on the other side of my family, they came to Louisville, Kentucky, and they stayed Jewish, except for one member of the family who was an Episcopal minister, and he went to jail against the war, fighting against the war in Vietnam. He was the one I really wanted to meet and did. So my background in religion was pretty nebulous, and by the time we had twins and another daughter, we had 3 little girls. We lived in Hamden, Connecticut, and my husband had received a fellowship at Yale, one of the first post-war 5-year fellowships. And we had a little box of a house, and it was a suburban life. And somebody in academia, family in academia, had heard that there was a Unitarian group forming. It turns out there was something called a religious census, and 10 different people who didn't know each other had said they were Unitarians. And those 10 people were, their dates, information was sent to Boston headquarters, and Boston got these 10 people together. And one of them was Mrs. Mayor Oakes, who had been a Sunday school teacher. And she said, "The hope is in the young. Let's start a Sunday school." So they rented an apartment and started a Sunday school. And I took my 3 little children there. And it was very idealistic. There was nothing about religion in conventional senses. They looked in microscopes, and the children never really felt part of things. And only one of 3 has stayed a Unitarian, and she's a very active one. She has been in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and been on the board and so forth. She is just moving to be near her son. I am that old, and that it's kind of a joke where I live, because people have moved here to be near their sons. That's a good bit about me. I married very young. I met my husband at our country place. My sister was getting a PhD at Columbia, and she invited her whole department to come up on a Sunday on the train. And we were sitting outside, and they were a motley crew because it was during the war, and some people had husbands that were overseas, etc. And there was only one other young person and me. And that young person asked if he could do the New York Times puzzle, which was lying on the grass. And somebody said yes. And he took out his fountain pen, and my eyebrows went up. That's how I first met my husband. He first met me because I was the kid sister. I was barefoot in shorts, and we had watermelon slices for dessert, and I was seeing how far I could spit the pits. And he said, "That's the girl for me." I've asked this question where I live now in a retirement home. How did you meet your husband? And mostly the answer is at church or at college. I don't get any wild stories like mine. I was not trained for anything when I not only married, but became pregnant and gave birth to twins. I gave birth to twins early, unexpectedly, and the doctor had not known they were going to be twins. And it was an emergency. They waited for my husband to come down from medical school. And I came out of anesthesia and said conventionally, "What is it?" And he said, "Girls, two." I said, "God, how stupid." And I came out a little more and I said, "Did I hear you right?" And he repeated it. I said, "I only meant to have one." So we had these two girls, and we gave the first one that was popped out the name we had for her, which was Kathy. And then he went home to find another name. And he came back, and we decided we really liked the name Betsy. But he said, "We better name her Elizabeth. She might be Vice President of the United States." And that was 77 years ago. It was a wild thought. And then just about 2 years later, we had a third daughter. And so my husband finished getting a PhD, and his first job was at Yale. He got one of the first post-war 5-year fellowships to study in the physiology department. So we moved to New Haven, and with my father's money, bought a little box of a house for $12,000, I seem to remember. And we were living this suburban life in which the children walked up to public school and came back for lunch and walked back up again after lunch. And I could see that they were not musical, and that the life that these other children were living was not exactly what I had in mind, nor for me, the life of toting children after school to this and that and the other thing was not exactly what I wanted to do either. They ended up saying what they wanted was horses. I had never wanted a horse, but apparently it turns out many pre-adolescent girls want horses. So we found 15 miles up into the hills, we found an old farmhouse, bought it from Mr. Peck, age 82, on Peck Road. And it came with a huge barn, still with a lot of hay in it. And by then we had become Unitarians, and we had a Unitarian picnic there. And all the children went to the barn, and all the adults went to the house. And over those years, we never had to go to the hospital. We never really had any broken bones. And it's sort of amazing because these kids would jump from one hay place to another, and they made musicals, they made jumping games. That barn was much used. And we got a pony, and they shared the pony for a year. And then they said, "But what we really want is a horse of our own." So first we got Lady, who was a great big ex-police horse, and very docile and very big and black. And then we got the Palomino, and the Palomino came with papers, and that was terribly exciting for the daughter that had the Palomino. So exciting that she slept on the hay in the barn the first night that she had her horse. And their childhood is unbelievable today, when people hardly let their children out of their sight. We had enough money for one saddle, and the first week I moved that saddle back and forth from one horse to another, at which point they learned to ride bareback, and the saddle stayed in the closet. And these kids, Emily inheriting the pony, and Elizabeth on this big black mare, and Kathy on the Palomino, they went out on these dirt roads, I knew not where. There were no cell phones. Nobody got a broken bone. They never went to the hospital. It's a lucky story, because I know many people have had much more trouble with their children than I ever did. we did that for a number of years until 1965, when my husband had become briefly famous. He modestly said there was nothing on AP that day, so it went around the world that he had isolated plasminogen. And on the basis of that, he was asked to be a chairman of the medical school here in Cincinnati. So we came driving 2 cars. We put the dog and the cat in the back car, and our girls were by that time in college, and we drove up and had bought a house in North Avondale. And it was the time of the riots. The very week we moved in, there were riots, but we were very well protected. And I had never heard of Cincinnati. I had become a potter and even an enamelist. I had seen a small kill in a store window, and it showed what you could do with it. And I thought I could do more than that. So I was an enamelist, and by sheer luck, Cincinnati is right next door to Florence, Kentucky, where there is a man who just died at 103, who had been an orphan. And in the orphanage, he learned that if he majored in ceramic engineering, there was a free scholarship to college. So he did that, and he made a plant down south, and then a plant here in Florence, Kentucky, that made colored glass fused to metal for businesses. Then he got interested in the art of enameling, and he hired some people that helped him with that, and he organized a worldwide organization, which meant a huge amount to me. I enameled in India, I enameled in England, I enameled in Europe, and I wrote for the magazine. And here, that's my work, and that's the cover of the magazine. And here is another page. So the fact that I moved to a place that I knew nothing about, it turned out to be a wonderful experience because it was right next door to this place that almost folded because the old man died, and his daughter in her 70s, her husband wasn't interested, and they were selling off whatever was valuable. And at the last minute, the man in Florence, Kentucky that has the main jewelry store bought the business. So it's going to continue, which makes me very happy. I wonder whether that isn't enough. I think it's been interesting to tell you my story. I guess I could ask if anybody had any questions.
We want to hear more about your world travels.
My world travels.
Mhm.
Well, at one point, my husband got 6 months off after teaching many years, and we bought a Fiat Multiple and put it on the Queen Mary and went to Europe and camped through Europe. He never asked for more money. I never suggested that he ask for more money. So we lived on $14 a day, including gas for the car. And we camped through Europe. We were the only Americans we ever saw, except one disgruntled husband and wife who was in the army, and she did not like camping. But otherwise, people had flags on their tents or their camping equipment because the Danes didn't want to be mistaken for the Germans and so forth. And everybody wore either red or blue 2-piece, I can't really call them pajamas, sweatsuits, I guess. And it was the time when we had Frisbees. So these places were not all like that, but many of these campsites were big, and they had a place where you could buy food because you were not allowed to cook in Europe. You were not allowed to have fires. So the food was pretty cheap and pretty basic. And we had this unusual camping gear and did that. And finally, my husband gave a talk in Vienna, and we camped up in the fall. We were the only campers at one point, and we heard the cowbells woke us up, and these 6 or 8-year-old children were leading the cows to pasture. And we got up to Paris, and we rented a pension. We were 3 children in one room, and my husband and I in the next room. And people said, "What did you eat in Paris?" Well, the pension had Spanish girls, and the food was not very good, very good. So people had visions of us glorying in French cooking, but it was not so. But the girls went to a French school, and it was only September, October, and it was, I guess it started in October, November, and half of December. We came back in time for Christmas, but they learned to speak French with French accents. Then they came back to America, where the French teacher had an American accent and kept correcting them. And they've been back since. And travels have been a good thing. We have a daughter who went from college right into the Foreign Service and wanted to go to India, and they gave her 6 weeks of training and sent her to India. So we decided we wanted to go visit her in India. And that's what really started us on our travels. And this remarkable man here in Florence, Kentucky, with this organization that was worldwide for enameling. I got to enamel in many countries, and that was part of the traveling.
Vivian, my oldest will turn 13 in a few months. What advice would you give a 13-year-old girl?
Oh, I'd have to know her a little bit to know what kind of a person she is, but I guess I would wonder what she most likes to do and who she can picture herself being sometime later, and take it from there. Is she a reader? Is she an athlete? Is she an unhappy child? There are all kinds of possibilities when you're 13.
I'd like to know how old your father was when he married your mother.
Well, he was through medical school and through a year in Germany. If you could afford it at that time, good training meant that you went for an extra year in Germany. And he was in his 40s, that's for sure.
So, what have you liked about Cincinnati now that you know it's just north of Kentucky?
Well, I think when I came, I was 40 or 41. My children were in college, and I could be anybody I wanted to be. My husband was very busy with a new career, new job. So I said yes to anything that I was invited to. And I even got dressed up to go to the grocery store, I seem to remember. And it was a very conservative town. The first sign I saw on top of the Baldwin building was "Get us out of the UN." The other thing was they were all worried about fluoride in the water. And I thought, my goodness, where have I come? But over the years, Hamilton County went Democratic recently. So they learn slowly, but they learn. Well, I hope you found this of interest. I know I had something I could read. I did some writing. I wrote some books, and I did some poetry, and I wrote this about age. You are as old as you feel, though all has a beginning and an end. Some cultures will tweak your shape and carry some, and earned wrinkles can be erased. Yet houses very old are highly prized, and ancient trees are venerated. Age used to be measured by rigid rules, when boys should wear long pants and girls put up their hair. Now everything goes or comes. How old is old? Do we need some markers? Asians are 1 at birth. Here, school at 6, vote at 18, drink at 21, Medicare at 65. Remember, old wood burns best, old wine preferred. Ripe age gives tone to old violins. With added years, a richer life begins. The spirit mellows, and old friends are more valued. We have played many parts along the way, and memories arise as time moves on. A life well lived can be enjoyed again, and you can be as young as you feel. Maybe
What a
that's
great end to tonight. Vivian, thank you so much for sharing about your life with us.
Well, it's been an interesting experience for me too. Goodbye.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Vivian.
Thank you, Vivian.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vivian.
Beautiful.
You were awesome.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you, Vivian.
Mhm.